Well, welcome to the last session of Faces and Traces of Violence of this academic year. And well, we're very happy to have here Gunnthorunn Gudmundsdottir. I pronounce it. We're practicing. Gunnthorunn completed her PhD from the University of London in 2000, and she is now a senior lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Iceland and head of cultural comparative studies. Her research interests lie mainly in the field of life writing and memory studies. She has written on Icelandic literature, literature in English, French, autobiography, and recent Spanish fiction on the Civil War, on the Spanish Civil War. Her book, which is entitled Borderlines, Autobiography and Fiction in Postmodern Life Writing, was published by Rodoki in 2003. And now she is working on a book on forgetting and various forms of life writing and fiction. And I have here some recent publications. I'll mention the ones that are originally in English, which is an article with Daisy Nijman, which is called Memory and Forgetting, Gaps, Ruptures, and National Past in Spanish and Icelandic Fiction, which is in a review. And another chapter in the book Life Writing in Europe, which is called Writers' Lives, the Modernist Group and Questions of Identity and Autobiographical Writing. Well, Gunnthorunn is also a member of the Post-Action in Search of Transnational Memory in Europe. So, transcultural memory in Europe. It's like June is the Post-Action month in Madrid. And we have her here to present her paper entitled Writing the Forgotten, Memory, Silence, and Fiction, in which she will talk both about Spanish literature and Icelandic literature. So, thank you very much for coming and making this long trip from Iceland all the way to Madrid. And
thank you.
The floor.
I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Francisco and Marije, for organizing it and getting me over here. We have had about wind and rain and 6 degrees in Iceland now for the last 3 weeks, so I'm very pleased to get a little bit of warmth at least. And I would like to today to talk about a research project that I have been working on with Dr. Daisy Nijman to explain its purpose and its central theoretical aims and maybe our initial findings. And the title of the project is Memory and Forgetting, Ruptures, Gaps in National Identity, and it is funded by the EDDA Center of Excellence at the University of Iceland. It's a center that is looking at political memory and responses to the financial crisis and so on. So it's an institute that we have some links to. So sort of what I will be talking about here today, it's also based on Nijman's research. Now, the purpose of the project is to investigate memory and forgetting in fictional texts in order to examine the representation of periods of trauma and rupture in two different societies, Icelandic and Spanish. And one of the main aims of this project is to consider the role of fiction in recovering or reinventing a forgotten or silenced past, in order to demonstrate how these textual expressions of memory and forgetting challenge the consensus, insist on unfinished business in order to effect collective transformation in the present, and thereby open up new possibilities for the shaping of the future. Now, the findings from the two different countries will be compared with the aim to reveal how trauma, memory, and forgetting are translated into narrative, and to what effect, and whether such textual expressions are nation culture specific, or whether it's possible to draw comparisons across different cultural contexts. Whether, for instance, these texts rather obey narrative needs and directives which transcend cultural linguistic borders. And we have been working on expanding this project, and we have a colleague now who's working on Algerian literature who is quite interested in working with us in the future. So we keep looking for more funding. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the dynamic between two vital concepts for this endeavor, memory and forgetting. The relationship between the two terms is, of course, not a stable one or one that can be easily defined. Maybe the closest one can get to classifying these terms is to say that they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, memory always entails forgetting and vice versa. In order to remember, one must have forgotten it first. The forgotten is an integral part of memory. In Andreas Heisen's words, inevitably every act of memory carries with it a dimension of betrayal, forgetting, and absence. And perhaps in reversal to our previous statement, in order to forget, one must have once remembered. I will therefore not attempt to disentangle these two concepts and place them in separate categories, but rather maintain and investigate the close but fraught connection between them, following and expanding on Jose Comero's ruminations on the subject, when he talks about how oblivion is full of memories, quoting Mario Benedetti, and quoting David Herzberger saying memory forgets. And thus memory and forgetting are articulated in a precarious balance of forces, always in a constant state of negotiation. Memory and forgetting are therefore caught in each other's web, and the complexities of the processes at work should not be overlooked. J. Winter adds another layer to the way in which the terms of memory and forgetting are traditionally viewed, a way which regards as insufficient in analyzing the social construction of the past. He puts forth a theory of silence to replace some of the commonplaces prevalent in the understanding of forgetting in memory discourse. Now, Paul Connaughton has talked about 7 types of forgetting, some of whom correspond to Winter's instances of silences. He talks of repressive erasure, prescriptive forgetting, forgetting that is constituted in the formation of a new identity, structural amnesia, forgetting as annulment, forgetting as planned obsolescence, and forgetting as humiliated silence. And Winter's and Connaughton's analysis both point to the fact that forgetting is perhaps too large or vague a category to be used as a critical tool, one that has critics and theorists looking for ways in which to further define what we mean by this term, especially when attempting to analyze its effect on collective memory. The social and political dimensions of forgetting have, of course, often been discussed in the wake of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and other times of trauma and crisis. Colmero discusses forgetting in relation to the legacy of the Spanish Civil War and the Franco era, and is of the opinion that forgetting is too careless a concept. He believes forgetting connotes an oversight, an accident, and proposes the word desmemoria, which implies faults in historical memory, lack of knowledge or interest in the past. Desmemoria is socially determined, and in Spanish history he traces it back to Franco's repressive regime, and its characteristics can be seen in censorship, in education, media, and political decisions made during the transition to democracy. So we have memory, forgetting, silence, desmemoria, 7 types of forgetting, and so on and so on. But Luisa Pasolini has emphasized that silence can also be a part of memory. Something may be unsaid because its memory has been actually repressed, or because the conditions for its expression no longer or do not yet exist. And sometimes a change in these conditions may break the silence and allow memories to be expressed, while at other times silence can last for so long and under such conditions that it may contribute to the effacing of memory and induce oblivion. We should therefore be careful to differentiate between natural oblivion or erosion on the one hand and deliberate or political silencing and desmemoria on the other. The memory boom towards the end of the millennium, with its profligation of memorials of war, the Holocaust, museums, and narratives, is contradictory in nature. The commemoration, the remembrance, the calls to remember are possibly the logical conclusion of a lack of historical consciousness, as some have claimed. The memorials bearing witness to our need to remember, but longing to forget our inglorious past. Writing text, building memorials, archiving the past, all bear within them an act of betrayal. And Ian Sinclair, in his book Lights Out for the Territory, claims memorials are a way of forgetting, reducing generational guilt to a grade of albino chess pieces, bloodless stalagmites, shapes that are easy to ignore, stand in for the trauma of remembrance. And I just chose this image to illustrate this monument in London. Tens of thousands of people walk by every day without, I think, giving much thought to its meaning or where it comes from, usually only sort of connecting to it as an underground station. That's the monument to the fire of London. So the trauma of remembrance does not necessarily always fit in with public memorialization. Memory used to describe efforts by individuals, groups, and states to foster or impose memory in order to propagate self-serving interpretations of the past. The making of a group memory so that it becomes an expression of collective identity and is accepted by that group as truth of experience. The role of literature we believe to be crucial as a means of questioning that truth of experience. And Astrid Erland and Rickney have suggested the three roles literature plays in the production of cultural memory. And they have these literature as a medium of remembrance, literature as an object of remembrance, and literature as a medium for observing the production of cultural memory. And our study focuses on how these literary memory works shape the past, engage with other memory texts, reveal memorial processes, and enter into a critical dialogue with established understandings of the past. By studying the reception and role of these literary, autobiographical, and testimonial texts, we aim to investigate how literature can contribute to historical knowledge, investigating the archive and public memory in ways that historiography maybe is traditionally less equipped to do, through the examination of personal understandings of the past, for which literature often serves as a model, and dealing with areas of language, narrative, imagination, allegory, and metaphor. Now, the examination of literary memory text proposes to show how literature may offer history as a permanent reactivation of the past in a critique of the present, by raising difficult questions avoided elsewhere, and how literary strategies help readers confront the ruptures and gaps in history. We are, of course, comparing two very different societies, and we are not comparing events as such at all. But what they do have in common is that they have both suffered various forms of social crisis in the 20th century, and where memory and forgetting are currently playing a primary role in their different attempts at coming to terms with the past. And in doing so, we aim at a transnational approach. Writers in both countries have been at the forefront of this process, experimenting with different ways of expressing trauma and regenerating collective memory, and opening up new ways of looking at history. And we think that such a comparative approach is fruitful, even necessary, by placing narrowly defined national crises and traumas in a larger context. It becomes possible to uncover general patterns and strategies in the processes of memory and forgetting, and their uses as political tools as well as personal and social forms of healing. It's important to emphasize that the memory of the past in these countries is not defined by national borders. The British and later United States occupation of Iceland is remembered in the countries involved in the occupation, and the Spanish Civil War, of course, is remembered extensively in other countries, be it from foreign journalists, exiles, or members of the international debate. So while trauma studies during the last 3 decades or so have argued the representative and narrative impossibility of trauma, a veritable growth in trauma narratives can nevertheless, in retrospect, be observed as having developed alongside it. The turn-of-the-century memory boom appears to have affected literature along with other public spaces, as Peter Middleton and Tim Wood's study of literatures of memory from 2000 shows. To Roger Luckhurst, this demonstrates that the impossibility of representing trauma generates not only narrative rupture, but narrative possibility as well. Cultural forms have provided the genres and narrative forms in which traumatic disruption is temporalized and rendered transmissible, he suggests. And despite the prescriptive aesthetic associated with canonical trauma fiction, that any literature that does not experiment uncompromisingly to find formal ways of conveying the aporia generated by traumatic experience is unethical, there has been an explosion of mainstream and popular texts dealing with trauma and memory, spanning a wide spectrum of fictional forms. Now, literature's recent preoccupation with memory, and more specifically traumatic memory, which developed out of the trauma debates in the wake of the clinical recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder in the 1980s, and equally out of anxieties relating to a loss of bearings and a disconnection from the past, based in the global village and the new media, producing a fear of forgetting and a desire to find security and identity in memory on both the personal and national level. As Heisen points out, in an age of emerging supranational structures, the problem of national identity is increasingly discussed in terms of cultural or collective memory, rather than in terms of the assumed identity of nation and state. Middleton and Woods have convincingly likened literature to a public memorial site, where readers can participate not only in the practice of memory, but in the processes of witnessing and increasing and correcting their own limited cognitive strengths. And Dominic LaCapra has written about literature's power to create empathic unsettlement in the reader, triggering a reinterpretation and recontextualization of memory, which may serve revised understandings of individual or collective selves. The function and narrative modes of these public memorial sites will be the focus of our investigation. In the wake of the wars of the 20th century, there has of course been a constant call to remember, what the French term devoir de mémoire, but critics from various disciplines have also noted the need to forget, to lay the past to rest, and we seldom do one without the other. As Adam Phillips indicates in his essay Freud and the Uses of Forgetting, there are episodes in our lives we can pretend to forget or have a frozen image of, and these can be desires, thoughts, stories, trauma, which psychoanalysis encourages people to work through, and which might not be in line with our image of ourselves. And this calls for a type of cooperation between memory and forgetting. But it also points to the close relationship between memory and narrative, memory and writing, and the issues that arise when writing memory. As Heisen claims, the fissure that opens up between experiencing an event and remembering it in representation is unavoidable. However, this fissure can also be regarded as a source of creativity, and what separates memory from an inert archive or systematic form of preserving the past. The creativity which has its origin in the ontological gap between memory and the original event and its representation. Literature, thus, is one mode of expression through which we may glimpse a society's attempts to work through and accommodate the past, its gaps and ruptures. Now let me say a few words on the Icelandic context. I think might be helpful to give some historical context here. It's not possible really to speak of an Icelandic war experience in the way that we use this term in relation to many other European countries, as although Iceland's self-declared neutrality was violated by the Allied occupation of the country on the 10th of May 1940, it was an occupation by friendly forces, so to speak, whose presence was intended to keep Iceland out of Nazi hands. And while many lamented the fact that Iceland had been dragged into a war, and there was widespread opposition against a large foreign army presence on the island, pragmatism quickly gained the upper hand. The occupation brought an abundance of work and money to an impoverished and underdeveloped society, and a general attitude to make best of the situation and enjoy whatever opportunities the army provided soon prevailed, since it had imposed its presence anyway. As a result, the war years have been regarded in Iceland as a boom period, and the fact that Icelanders allowed themselves to profit from a war that plumbed new depths as to the suffering and death it caused on an unprecedented scale has been quietly forgotten. This mode of thinking, the profiteering side of Icelandic business at the cost of and with the dismissal of the pains of others, is also said to be one of the factors that led to the 2008 banking crash in Iceland, indicating that times of crisis draw on societal memory and our sense of our past selves. And this sense of ourselves and national identity is, of course, hotly debated in Iceland at the moment, with the majority opting for a nostalgic vision of pre-crash Iceland by voting last April for the parties which created the conditions for the crash in the first place. And this is by an Icelandic cartoonist. This is a map of Iceland turned into a goldfish with its connotations of loss of memory, and the skull at the bottom it doesn't see. So despite these unusual circumstances in the war, it nevertheless constituted a rupture in Icelandic society, a period where Icelanders experienced overwhelming shock and disorientation and disjunction, albeit of a different kind from many other European countries. The army presence exponentially accelerated the introduction of modernity into a society which was still almost exclusively rural, relying primarily on fishing and pastoral farming, isolated from the European mainland for the most part, and without any experience of urbanism, industrialism, machinery, or indeed weapons and warfare. Almost overnight, the country was catapulted into the 20th century and into unprecedented wealth and opportunity. People flocked to the coastal towns and villages, especially to the capital, Reykjavik, where a foreign consumer economy and culture transformed the lives of everyone. The resulting seismic changes in wars and way of life caused a profound anxiety and loss of bearings as centuries-old security suddenly became unsettled. The effects of this experience of the consequences of modernity has been viewed as traumatic in nature, causing a gap or rupture in understanding, in representation, and causing memory. As Richard Turkman points out, in a world of change, memory becomes complicated. Any revolution, any rapid alteration of the givens of the present places a society's connection with its history under pressure, producing a cultural disquiet and the perception of an abyss in time. He has termed a memory crisis. And this crisis manifests itself in feelings of exile, anxiety, and displacement, as well as a sense of disarticulation of the very coherence of time and of subjectivity. The loss of a sense of time's continuous flow and of our unproblematic place within it, the disruption of organic connection with the past. Such representations indicate an epochal rupture, a perception by those living within it, and the world has decisively changed. The politics of memory and representation regarding these changes has been one of nostalgia as well as amnesia. And these terms have also applied to some of the responses to the financial crash, as I mentioned. As various scholars have pointed out, Icelanders have tended to rely on simplified heroic images of an imagined medieval past to construct a national identity, indulging in a general amnesia regarding a more painful and humiliating post-medieval past molded by the effects of colonialism and centuries of poverty and isolation. Collective Icelandic memory since the Second World War is not least produced by the paradoxical melange of rapid economic growth, technological modernization and mass consumption, in conjunction with political conservatism and a retrospective cultural orientation in order to sustain a national identity based on freedom and independence. Again, we have parallels with the financial crisis, where before the crash, Icelandic businessmen and bankers working in Britain and elsewhere were described as modern Vikings, winning new territory and conquests. Now, the Icelandic post-war literature played a highly influential role in the mediation of these narratives of nostalgia and cultural conservatism, and in generating a specific mode of remembering the past. As Ástráður Eysteinsson points out, the rural novel became a dominant form in Icelandic fiction after the war. Instead of examining the overwhelming social, cultural, and psychological changes and providing critical observation of their effects in post-war Iceland, it became a means of representing a particular version of the recent past by conventionalizing a specific narrative formula, topoi and symbols, all based in a profound sense of loss and alienation from the present, which remains nevertheless unexplored. The basic narrative sequence is that of a young man, only very rarely a young woman, leaving the countryside to try his luck in the city, where he encounters an alien culture to which he cannot or will not adapt. Idealism quickly turns into disillusionment, melancholia, and nostalgia, yet there appears to be no way back. The past has become inaccessible and too other to integrate into the present. This representation is clearly based in our imagination of memory as recollecting and unifying, when what it really does, it makes an absence present. In Ferdinand words, memory figures the inauthenticity of presentness, the traumatic persistence of an irreversible experience of loss. So instead of a soul-searching confrontation with traumatic fractures, however, the rural novel reproduces instead a victim myth generated in public and media discourse shortly after the occupation took place, where the other, in the form of a foreign soldier and fraternizing women, becomes the scapegoat for a general sense of loss, guilt, and shame. Notions that were echoed when Britain and Holland insisted Icelanders should pay their bankers' debts after the crash. A very similar kind of discourse prevailed. It was rather expedient, and in Iceland there was no pact of silence or oblivion in relation to the war. It was rather politically expedient and morally convenient to focus on nostalgia rather than guilt, and the emotional turbulence due to loss in collective memory, and to forget the shame of poverty and colonialism in the rush of building up a modern independent Iceland, with the help of martial aid, which was originally meant for the reconstruction of European countries left in ruins after the war, but which Iceland managed to secure in its negotiations with the US to allow a military base in the country on a more permanent basis as the Cold War loomed. And this continued army presence was highly controversial, and it could in fact be argued that one reason why Icelandic literature did not engage in any soul-searching confrontation with the effects of the war years is because, for some at least, the occupation did not end until 2006, when the last US soldiers left. During the Cold War, the representation of a foreign military presence in Iceland became even more conventionalized, as well as highly politicized. And this undoubtedly influenced memories about the occupation of Iceland during the Second World War and their role in Icelandic literature. Nyman has, however, identified a number of works that defy these conventional categorizations and interpretations. With her analysis of these works, she has shown how fiction has represented traumatic pasts, social disruption and shock, but which, due to rigid political lines during the Cold War, went by unnoticed, but attacks that the events in recent years have drawn our attention to again and have gained new relevance for modern readers. I hope this has given you a little idea of the Icelandic background. Now, in places where the past is contested, where collective memory is far from stable, where traumatic events have set their mark on the population, historical fiction, or what we can term memory texts, can have a particular function or display and reveal anxieties about that contested past. Novelists might refer to or include different types of historical documentation in their search for the past, in blurring of boundaries between historiography and fiction, and the works often involve a performance or staging of memory and remembrance, confirming or challenging different forms of collective memory, be it nostalgic or with intention to traumatic ruptures. The documentary and the narrative film, the autobiography and the novel, historical narrative and fiction, the boundaries between these traditionally divided fields have been crisscrossed and blurred, eroded and challenged repeatedly in the last few decades. But still, in some ways, we still rely on these boundaries, the division between fiction and the factual in our everyday dealings with a variety of media, in our consumption of the news, both text and photographs, in the gap that fake autobiographies expose in their reception. Here I want to talk a little bit about what happens in works of fiction which address a much debated memory and make use of documentary evidence such as photographs, diaries, letters, etc., and thus have a particular relationship with discourse on memory and the past. I think our response to one type of documentation is particularly revealing. The documentary value of the photograph has throughout its history been contested and threatened by the very technology itself, as it is more perfect than the eye and does not an accurate representation of our vision, and by fakes and forgeries of every conceivable kind, and with the birth, of course, of the digital age, the possibilities for tinkering with its forms and endless. And here are just a few famous examples from the history of photography of fakes and forgeries. So the photograph is one of the most common documentary sources used every day in news outlets, family albums, social media, and ID cards to prove, establish, and represent events in existence, but it's also a source which is incredibly easy to forge. Nevertheless, it retains in our minds a sense of what Roland Barthes has termed the has been there, and our reliance on its documentary value does not seem to diminish. Just as the photographs I have shown here in this talk have been used to present a sort of a truth, a sort of to illustrate the veracity of my account. The meaning of photographs must, however, be contingent upon collective memory, as is evident in ritualistic photographs such as the wedding photograph. What counts as a wedding photograph has specific connotations, it has a specific look. A photograph of people getting married isn't necessarily a wedding photograph. As Barbie Selleser points out, the discussion of visual memories become at some level discussions of cultural practice, of the strategies by which images are made and collected, retained and stored, recycled and forgotten. By definition, this connects visual memories with culture socially, politically and economically mandated and sanctioned modes of interpretation, with how certain uses of images are set in place, challenged and legitimated. As Benedict Anderson puts it in Emerging Communities, the photograph, a fine child of the age of mechanical reproduction, is only the most peremptory of a huge modern accumulation of documentary evidence, which simultaneously records a certain apparent continuity and emphasizes its loss from memory. And this double pull of the photograph has at times been used to an interesting effect in fiction, for example in the works of such authors as W.G. Sebald and Michael Ondaatje. Now, historical and collective memory in 20th century Spain has of course gone through many stages of repression, exile and erasure, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you about that. And these conflicting discourses have of course resulted in many and varied attempts at finding ways to negotiate between memory, forgetting and silence. In this search, writers resort to different methods and approaches, highlighting the problems involved in fictionalizing a contested pasts. Novelists here have grappled with the country's complex relationship with the past since the transition, but not least in the current boom in writing of the Civil War and Franco's legacy. Perhaps then it is no wonder that novels which in one way or another straddle the borders between fact and fiction use photographs in such a prominent way on their covers to announce the novel's status as a memory text. And here are just a few examples from recent years. And this is in line with Christian von Schilke and Dagmar Schmelzer have called docufiction, and all of you have discussed this. These characteristics of this boom. And of course, Javier Cercas' Soldados de Solomino is a much discussed and famous example of this. And theorists have noted the author's successful positioning of the work on the borderline between fact and fiction, mixing fictional accounts with a documentary style narrative. And in the Catalan author Jaume Cabrés' Las Veus del Pamano, where he traces the story of the imaginary Catalan village of Torrella through the 20th century, civil war, dictatorship and the transition, we follow one character's search for the past, the burning need to find the truth behind layers of forgetting, silence, false trace and lies. And the main character discovers diaries of a former headmaster, long considered a hero of the Phalangists. The diaries tell of a hidden past and stories of betrayals in political and private life, lies and repression. The author's use of this well-known trope of the found manuscript gives a certain legitimacy to the narrator's account and affords her a larger historical perspective in which to situate her own troubles. And this juxtaposition between present and past is of course one of the characteristics of many of these works. Now in Jordi Soler's trilogy, which was published in one volume as La Guerra Perdida, where he traces his family's past, their war, their exile in Mexico, attempting to marry half-told stories, family rumors, and historical accounts of these events. Again, we have the staging of the search for the past, this time at least partly an autobiographical search. And in the first part of the trilogy, Los Rostros de Ultramar, from 2004, Soler describes several ways in which he was able to research his grandfather's story through diaries and journals his grandfather wrote, a familiar narrative trope, as Francisco Ferrándiz has pointed out. And also through interviews he takes with them in his later years, through research in archives such as the one kept in the attic of the Mexican embassy in Paris, and through visiting the sites he talked about, in particular the site of the camp in Arches-les-Chemins. Soler describes that on hearing of his grandfather's manuscripts, he felt he had to do something with them, to answer the call of the archive, to transform the archive's pure potential, as a later Asman would put it, into a powerful object that can be transmitted and received by future individuals who, in witnessing the witness, will themselves learn and know and remember. It is on this visit that the gap between events and the present becomes the most prominent and troubling. The narrator explains, "The truth is that it would disturb me as much to find traces, many of few, as not to find any. Deep down I knew that my Arches-les-Chemins I inherited from my grandfather. It isn't a physical place, but a memory more than 70 years old, and this memory, which I am attempting to reconstruct, is difficult to coincide with this physical place, which is 70 years younger." The Mediterranean tourist town has no traces, it has no space to remember. Its wartime past does not fit in with the beaches, hotels, and camping grounds, as he finds when he reads a brochure from the local authorities, which historical chapter on the 20th century fails to mention the 100,000 Spanish who sought refuge on that beach in dreadful conditions, dying of typhoid and other such diseases, in the sand that is now cleaned with state-of-the-art technology, so it can fly the blue flag, identifying it as a clean and healthy beach. A taxi driver tells him, however, there is a monument in town, close to the beach between two campsites. It isn't very prominently displayed, and the narrator walks by it a couple of times until he notices it, a small white weather-beaten obelisk with a plaque at its foot. The location of the monument, the feeling of dislocation the narrator experiences, the traceless beach, means that instead of finding a site of memory, he writes a text that becomes a memorial site for the events recounted. In the last part of the trilogy, La Fiesta del Oso from 2009, Soler finds himself reluctantly in Arches-les-Chemins again, this time as a guest of an association of the descendants of the refugees of the Retirada. A woman whom he describes as a down and out comes up to him and hands him a stained photograph, which on later inspection he discovers to be of his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-uncle who disappeared in 1939. The woman had been prompted by the publicity surrounding the first volume of Soler's trilogy to correct his family's belief that Oriol, the great-uncle, had died attempting to cross the Pyrenees in 1939, which they had presumed from a letter they received from one of his travelling companions in 1994. Up until then, having imagined him well either as dead or as a successful pianist somewhere in Europe or South America. The photograph prompts the narrator to search for his uncle and takes him on a quest to a tiny village in the French Pyrenees, and in a fairy tale-like account, he meets a giant who had helped people cross the mountains, first Republicans crossing over to France and then Jews taking the opposite route later on. The giant confirms that he helped Oriol and that he survived, and this leads the narrator to another photograph, this time in an online police archive, a photograph of a broken man, possibly a monster, a photograph the narrator has no intention of sharing with the family, or with the reader, revealing that not any type of photograph or document from the past can serve the purpose of giving us back the past, of uniting us in remembrance, but that some are unacceptable, do not fit in with the viewer's expectations or hopes. And this photograph in the police archive of a convicted robber and murderer reveals a glaring contrast with the family's history of him, either as a dead war hero or a successful pianist. As I mentioned earlier, the use of historical black and white photographs seem ubiquitous on the covers of novels of this period. And Luisa Pasolini takes photographs as an example of how memory can be passed on in silence, just as the woman hands him the photograph. Without verbalization, silence is connected to remembering, not forgetting. Photographs reminds us of death, but they also are a way for us to remember the dead, to keep repeating endlessly one moment in time. At times, it seems that the use of these photographs is an attempt to reverse the process of death. The works I have mentioned here constantly crisscross the borderlines between historical and autobiographical and fictional accounts. Sarcasm, a mixture of fact and fiction, is Hristova Salamina, Cabrera with the time-honored trope of the found manuscripts, so there in his search for answers to his family's history in an effort to explore his own post-memories through different types of historical sources. The constant oscillation between the factual and fiction is a feature that some of the authors deliberately address. The narrator in Soler's second part of his trilogy draws attention to the fact that he has used the word truth repeatedly in the first page of the work, and says, I don't know if it's right to write the word truth so many times on the first page of the novel. The use of the photographs point to their complex status between fiction and fact, interrupting the silence, reversing the process of forgetting, but also complicating that process, pointing to the blurred picture of the past that can be transmitted this way. The constant referential aspects of these works, how they continually mention some type of source, documents, manuscripts, historical accounts, reveals, I believe, a certain anxiety about the role fiction can play in a meaningful discourse on a traumatic past. Now, I wanted to conclude my talk today with a brief discussion of a novel that I hope will bring together the different threads I have mentioned in my talk. The novel is called Across the River Ebro, and it's by an Icelandic novelist and a professor of Spanish and French literature, Gunnthorunn Gudmundsdottir, and it was published in 2001. It tells the story of Harald, an elderly man who reminisces about the time he fought with the international brigades in the Civil War. He paces around his apartment in Reykjavik. His wife seems to have disappeared. His son comes once in a while to take care of him, but he's always in a rush and never has time to listen. Harald's memory is not too good, which is particularly noticeable in his everyday life, as he cannot remember what he's eaten, or if he has eaten, what happened earlier that day or the day before. So he tends to sit in his darkened living room with an old map of Ebro as a memory aid, and transports himself back to the past and remembers a time in his life he thought it was best to forget, but has realized that he has to remember, and more importantly, to recount. Harald tells of the last year the International Brigade fought in Spain and describes in detail the Battle of the River Ebro. The work describes the conditions, the political background, and the atmosphere with great insight. This attention to detail and precise descriptions keeps in the foreground the complex circumstances and avoids a black and white picture of events. The military maneuvers and battles are, however, not seen from above, but from the ground, so to speak. The reader follows the viewpoint of the Icelandic country boy who has no experience of war, who for ideological reasons, but also for other reasons, felt compelled to fight fascism. Historical events, terror, trauma, war, context, and effects of the war is mediated through the personal vision and memory of the old man, a man who ever since has lived in the shadow of these events, burdened by them, but without being able to talk about them, silent until now. He desperately wants to tell his story, but gets impatient, avoids difficult moments, as the time when he got wounded, until the very end of his tale, and the narrative isn't very well ordered. And as I said before, his memory is faulty. This is the very opposite of nostalgia. This is the traumatic past which doesn't leave him alone. He describes his thoughts as his enemies, and the metaphor of war is the base of the narrative. A story of war becomes a battle. The terrible memories of fallen friends and companions haunt him, but are also one of the hindrances in the telling, as he survived when so many did not, and this makes it hard for him to celebrate his own survival. Wars can generate a certain type of narrative. A consensus forms as to what the war meant, a process which, of course, as many times been hampered by circumstances as it has during the dictatorship in Spain. But the stories from members of the International Brigade formed one such narrative, the story of the Civil War outside Spain. But the war had no such narrative in Iceland. Only 3 Icelanders fought there as far as we know, and another larger war which followed on overshadowed what had gone before. Harald therefore doesn't get any public recognition for his suffering, and in a war that he fought out of idealism, he felt betrayed. He describes the scene where Danish volunteers are greeted with flowers and speeches when he arrives with them in Copenhagen on his way home. No one remembered the fallen or the wounded. They would have spoiled the moment's immense joy, the bloody hero worship which had taken over in those years. And no one meets him when he arrives in Reykjavik. He is alone on the pier. He does not get to play the role of the war hero, even if he didn't want to. It's as if he doesn't exist. His experience in no way fits Icelandic reality. Alistair Thompson has claimed that our memories are dangerous and uncomfortable when they do not fit in with common values or ideas about the past. And Thompson takes an example of Australian soldiers in the First World War coming back home and attempting to conform their own memories and identity with Jack the Lad image the public held of them. The feeling that their memories do not conform to these values after the war increased their discomfort and dissatisfaction. Harald has to fight that kind of understanding of the Civil War, both lack of public narrative but also contrasting notions people do have. A story needs a listener, a testimony, a witness. As trauma studies have taught us, Harald's main interlocutor is his late wife. His memory is faulty, as I've explained, and he believes that she has left him, and he rages against her sitting alone in his living room. He is convinced that she will be unable to understand his story. Her world is too far removed from the reality of war. He recounts how horrific memories and experience forced themselves on Icelandic reality where it didn't belong and scared his family. In one instance, he lectures his son on hunger and ingratitude when he doesn't finish his dinner. His wife scolds Harald and tells him not to judge everything according to his bitter experience. Their marriage does not seem to have been a happy one, and one of the reasons is the mixture of this experience and the silence surrounding this experience which shapes their lives. Harald does at times wonder whom he is telling the story. To whom do I want to tell the truth? To myself? That's not too bad. Clear away the lies. What is then left behind? The truth. Everyone knows it's relative, and I am only killing time, talking to myself like a child. Perhaps my son is right. I can see it in his face that he thinks I'm senile. The conversations with his wife are characterized by a sense of misunderstanding and impatience. Harald maintains that she doesn't understand his past. She claims he never gave her a chance. Harald says the silence was the only option as no one was interested in the story. His wife, however, says he fled into silence. The reasons for this silence is varied and manifold. One important thread in his description of the war is, for instance, the emphasis placed on with whom he speaks, whom he trusts, whom he wants to speak to, what people say, and what consequences their words have. The knowledge of the fighters in the war about what was happening was based on hearsay or propaganda. If you were guilty of saying something that you shouldn't have, you could expect to be punished. Talking, telling is never innocent in war, it is part of the weaponry. The image that is drawn of the individual's fate up against traumatic world events forced the reader to look at the war close up, so to say. It doesn't get away with the comfortable distance of Icelandic prosperous and peaceful society. But it also may imply that Iceland wasn't immune from the war, that the suffering may have been silenced, but it didn't disappear. War is in the living room, suffering is close by and intrusive. The breaking of the silence brings Harald back to himself just in time. At the end of the work, his listener is his grandson, and the telling has caused him to make peace with his wife and with her death. This novel, which came out in 2001, as I said, in a full-blown memory boom, received great critical acclaim and won the Icelandic Literature Award. The author's rendition of the common themes of memory texts, the staging of remembrance, the use of historical documents and testimonies, her awareness of the complexities of memory, forgetting, and silence, her focus on personal experience of traumatic historical events, and how the stories of these events trickle down the generations, seem to find correspondence in Spanish texts of the same period, down to the photographs on the cover. We have here the war photograph juxtaposed with the couple in Icelandic native. The race against time Harald experiences and which causes him to tell the story, even if it is for the most part only to himself, echoes and mirrors the frantic remembrances and memorialization all over Europe and much of the Western world at the turn of the millennium. the attempt to catch the memories of the 20th century before it was too late, to break silences, to write the forgotten, to place our cultural memory and thereby our identity firmly in the walls of that century. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I mean, I have a lot of notes, but I'll open the floor first to all of you. So if you have questions or comments, feel free. You can also ask in Spanish if you want, because Gunnthorunn speaks some Spanish, and if not, we'll help with the translation. So if you want to ask in Spanish, si queréis preguntar en castellano, también hacemos un experimento bilingüe.
Thank you very much. It was very well, and this is superb because it gives us a new twist to even not just the civil war, but also what the international brigades might need. It's an award-winning book I've never heard of. So, the civil war. So I was in relation to the award-winning thing, and you referred a lot of times to the memory boom and whatnot. So I was wondering if in your project, because you work a lot from history to the novel and from the cover to the plots and whatnot inside the novel, but I was wondering if you have also included in the, because I think this makes sense, no? In your broad analysis of the memory market or the editorial policies or the editorial projects in which these books are being produced, or why at certain points in time there is like a demand for this kind of literature, because publishers are not going to be publishing this if there was not, a collective of people eager to consume this, and also in terms of we might think of in terms of cycles. This is cyclical, no? Like comes and goes, and we are seeing it in Spain. So I think that the way in which all of these literature relates to a memory market is different elements that are. I mean, I don't know if you have also this included into your broader project, and if so, what can you tell us about what's going on in the memory market in Europe, particularly Iceland and Spain?
But yeah, I think it's very important to keep this in mind, and I think definitely the cycles we go through in sort of in memory texts and why they suddenly become so popular and why they're suddenly published so many of them and how are they published and as editorial decisions like the photographs, as I mentioned. I think that's all very important. And one thing that we did notice when we started researching this area in Iceland was that we had one of my students went and investigated all of the trauma memorials in Iceland, just trying to see where they were and when they had been built and why and so on and so on. Most of them are concerned with fishermen. Every fishing town has a memorial to their fishermen. But the discourse that he found in the papers when they were erected and so on was completely in line with memorials around wars. So exactly the same kind of discourse that had gone on in Europe after the First World War with Elmer Soldier and so on was translated into the Icelandic context like that. So you can definitely see these correlations between memory discourses in Europe and Iceland, although it's of a different kind and often of a different period, often with a certain delay. And I think that's also one of the things that we are looking into this why is this delay happening and why specifically here and not there and so on. But I think, yeah, it's definitely important.
Yeah, thanks for your lecture. I wonder a little bit about the different languages that you employ and which are also being employed in your project. I mean, fiction is, and I'm not a literary scholar, I'm professionally challenged by a sociologist. Literature, as I understand it, is fiction. They can make up things. They can lie, they can rely on history, they cannot rely on history. They can make up stories. And that's one of the wonderful things about fiction, that they can make up stories. Now, as a theorists looking on materials which are basically made up, are we sort of like becoming literary ourselves and can make up our interpretation of these stories? Or do we have to employ another set of an epistemological structure which says, but we are sort of like, we are scholars, so we have to tell the truth. But we have to tell the truth about lies or about made-up stories. So how does that work? I mean, because I wonder. I mean, I was also thinking about why Iceland and Spain, why not Slovakia and Lithuania? Like, and I'm sure that there must be some criteria why you have chosen these two countries, and maybe these are the two countries you know best, and this is enough of a criteria to choose them and to compare them. But in many ways, I didn't understand what justified the comparison between Iceland and Spain, and like I said, why not like Estonia and Czech Republic or Portugal or whatever. So if there must be some criteria when you compare, how do you look at it? And the third point is that one about the beautiful things about literature, I think, is that even if they write within a national frame and write within a national language, because they are, due to the fact that they're writing fiction, they're joining a transnational community in many ways. That doesn't mean they have to be translated. It means that they're using something that transcends the boundaries of the nation. Why you sort of like, I had a feeling in your paper, you're putting them back into sort of like the national containers. They're becoming like illustrations for what is going on in Iceland, and the others are becoming illustrations for what is going on in Spain, and they're becoming nationalized. They're becoming renationalized through your sort of like cultural analysis. And I think this is, in many ways, I felt that this is doing a little bit of injustice to the genre of literature, which by itself sort of like explodes the national container. And I mean, when you look, for instance, at American Jewish literature, these are like young people in their 30s and 40s, like the new generation, like Nathan Englander and Nicole Krauss and Ferrer and Shaden and all these people. They write in America, they write in English, and Nathan Englander, for instance, has written about a book about the desaparecidos in Argentina, through like a Jewish, through a story of a Jewish family. He has never been to Argentina. He has even said that. I've never been to Argentina. I've met people from Argentina. They've told me stories. I've read a couple of books. And I've made up the story about a Jewish family in Buenos Aires looking for their disappeared son in a kind of Kafkaesque ways. And what you read in this book is like, you read a story of Jews, you read a story of American sensibilities, you read a story about Argentina, and you read sort of like a story which could have been written by the Jewish writers of the 19th century in this kind of metaphysical and mythical way, and all that. And you have written about this Garcia Ortega, no, who was like picked up on Primo Levi's story about this little boy in the concentration camp, and has sort of like traveled with it. And these people are sort of like, even though they're writing in English, they're writing in Spanish, they have stopped being Spaniards or Americans, and they have joined sort of like a transnational universe of discourse, which is enabled by literature. And I wonder if as cultural analysts, we should sort of like respect that, and not sort of like force them back into some kind of national container.
I'll try to. I think my last example was supposed to show that this was a transnational phenomenon and not here we have a text in Icelandic on the Spanish Civil War, and of course, Alvin did not fight in the Spanish Civil War, and so I think my last example was exactly that, trying to show that these trends in literature are not bound by borders, national borders at all, and that is the reason for our comparison. Is because these things in European literature are not defined by national borders. There's something that is going on in many countries at the same time. There's popularity of historical fiction, the uses of documentation, the obsession with 20th century history and memory. So that is the basis of our comparison. We started with 2 places, but we want to expand them. So we want to work with scholars who work on other types of literature. But the reason for the comparison is because what we saw as a trend here and in Iceland was how much emphasis there was on the fiction in the general discussion. How an important part authors were playing in the reinterpretations of the past. Of course, being a literary scholar, I think the truth is to be found in literature. So of course that is where my field is. But also the emphasis these texts all place on verisimilitudes, that they are like something that happened, even if they are not an historical truth, they are a version of that truth. And that is something that I think is very interesting to see in this type of fiction, why there is such an emphasis on truth, on documentation, on referential aspects, which is different in many other texts who are not concerned with this at all. But I think in this type of text, this is very important and is transnational and is comparable. So I hope I've answered some of your questions.
I'm not sure whether this is a question or just a comment, but in Colombia we have a particular kind of this historical fiction because the conflict is not something that is in the past, but nowadays is happening. So I have been wondering how to work with this material, these fictions, because last week I met a former journalist who used to work in these areas where the conflict was taking place. I used to write just these articles for the newspaper. And nowadays she's writing novels about conflict. And what she said is she's using now some material that she collected at the time, but she couldn't use it because it was so dangerous for the witnesses or for the victims, actually for herself. So he couldn't use this material, he couldn't tell these stories, or she wasn't able to use a lot of things that she heard where she was working. And now she's using this information that she collected before for writing her novels, her fictional stories. But what I wonder is how to work with this, because this kind of material you don't know, you can't be sure what is true, what is a kind of reality. So at the end you have this mixture, and I don't know how as academics we can use this strange fictional text. I mean, strange because it's a fictional story. I mean, in this case she created the characters, and maybe the background is or the place where the story is taking place, a fictional place. But you know that there are some truths there. So how to work with this? This is fine.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what kind of historical document is a fiction? Can it be used as a source? Is that sort of maybe what you're thinking? And of course that's
the other way around.
yeah.
What you're saying, history books are actually fiction.
Mm-hmm. And how can an academic work with a fiction that is in some ways historical and some not? Of course, there's a way of reading literature that would look at it as in terms of metaphor. Is it a metaphor for something that's happened, maybe? Or is it a sort of version of events that can be justified to use as a source? But also, and one of the things that I didn't mention, but is also very important, is how sensitive it can be to work with historical documents in this fashion. I mean, it's often criticized, saying, "Oh, you've turned this story around. It didn't really happen like this. You shouldn't use real characters because then you are commenting in a way that is inappropriate," and so on and so on. And one Icelandic novel, which came out in Spanish just a couple of weeks ago, called "The Woman at 1,000 Degrees," by a man called Hallgrímur Helgason, has generated a lot of debate because he uses a known person, a real character, as a base for his novel, and his family has been quite upset by this, and so on and so on. So it's a very sensitive issue of how to use real people in fiction, and there's of course very often debate. And one of the things that one of the problems that arise in the analysis is how to deal with that. But of course, we ask this first and foremost. You're talking about fiction, in that it can be based on documents and make use of documents, but we're not looking at it as historically accurate. But as I said before, we are looking at things like verisimilitude. Is it could it have happened? Is it believable? It's one of the things that we read into novels of this kind. But historical fiction has often generated this kind of discourse. What kind of role can it possibly have? Isn't it just made up adventures from the past?
Would you suggest that you use your method also when to look at testimony?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, testimony, and you can look at it in terms of the narrative conventions employed and so on. I mean, that's one of the things people have looked at. In how do people tell their story? What kind of narrative conventions do they base them on? And these narrative conventions can be found in fiction among other places, but also in different kinds of texts, autobiographical texts and so on.
So people analyzing testimony should be then literary scholars rather than anthropologists or sociologists.
I'm not saying everybody.
I'm trying to release your duty.
No, but I think this applies to all disciplines because if you are a historian, for example, the bureaucracy, Franco's bureaucracy of death, is absolutely full of lies. I mean, there are fictions and terrible fictions. So if you are a historian, without a critical apparatus accessing this document, you are going to be, in a similar situation. So I think that, obviously each source has its complexity. So the thing is how to put together a critical apparatus to access and analyze that reality. But I don't see, of course there are like hard data, but the way in which they are set up, moved around, obliterated and whatnot, it's also absolutely crucial. So I would ask the same question you have asked her regarding how to deal with historical texts. I would ask a historian, for example, or even a political scientist, which sometimes to work. I don't know. I think this is a debate we have all the time.
I was wondering,
methodological.
like we're talking now about the relation between fiction and history. But aren't these memory novels? So I think the interest in these novels is not so much what really happened, but what is interesting is how we narrate the past, or what stories do we tell about the past. I mean, independently from if it was really like that or not, but what are the stories that remain, or what are the stories that circulate about that past? So in that sense, of course, at a certain moment, it's interesting to say, hey, is this a real character, or was this a real character? But in a sense, I think what literary scholars look at is not that much the historical truth that is behind it, but the stories, the metaphors, the plots that are used to actually make that past workable in the present or something like that. But and related to that, I have a question about narration and memory, or like the narration in text and the use of pictures, which seems to refer more to a visual paradigm than a narrative paradigm. So I was thinking if you could say something about that in relation to the type of memory culture that we have right now. That it seems that the narrative paradigm that was maybe 30 years ago very important in memory culture nowadays doesn't seem to suffice our need for the past or
so we have these types of visual memories, like the photographs I talked about, that have a different set of sort of interpretive problems, and when they are used and juxtaposed with text, there's some kind of the connection between image and text is of course always very interesting. Two different ways of telling a story, really, and I'm interested in what happens when they come together. What happens, because an image is rarely without a narrative or text that somehow guides our interpretation of that image. And there are also these sort of conventions and ways of looking, ways of seeing that are important, I think, with that. And of course, nowadays, in the way we express ourselves through different media, of course, the visual is very important. And this is Facebook and that kind of media, the way to express yourself. Where you tell your story these days, you rarely do without the image. So I think that there's a lot of things that are going on right now about how that would develop or what would happen and the role of the photograph versus the text and so on. I think that it's a very interesting area.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, for me it has to do something with the idea of the past becoming present instead of narrating or telling it or putting it into already an explanatory framework or something like that. But I'm also not sure about the relation with the text.
Well, it's very interesting because our last seminar was about Memoria photography, and she was she was from Hungary. She was using this image for her cover. It was very controversial because it was the execution of a she perpetrator, of a woman who, because her book is called Invisible Perpetrator. So we spent a good deal of time because I don't exactly remember if this image she pulled from right-wing web pages, because she was basically mining right-wing web pages, because a lot of the images of perpetrators in Hungary were kind of hidden, particularly the involvement of women. So she was going to this right-wing, she even had a profile, an official one and a fake one, a fictional one. And then she would use these images. And so the thing was, she had the image there, like this one. It was a woman who was about to be executed. And there was somebody else who had been executed. And so we were debating about the convenience or the limits of representation or what kind of image do you bring to a cover, because the thing is, it's not just the picture. Because we said, how is the book going to be titled? Because the title is going to change the interpretation of that image, your own country and beyond in the history. Invisible perpetrator. So you have a woman, looking like a housewife, about to be executed because of some crimes. But I also have, in the last few years, I have had problems also in collecting photographs with analysis. For example, there is one book called Anastasia Franco's Legacy, maybe you know it, because it's about literature and memory also. And so I had a paper because I was in the conference and whatnot, and I mean, this is just a story, I mean, but the thing is that they told me that I could use images, and we usually use images when we do an analysis because it helps people, focus on certain aspects. And so when the book was already printed, they said, well, no images. We decided on no images. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense because you just told me from the very beginning. I mean, I wrote the paper around 5 images, and I finished in one of the images, so you say that there are no images. No, so I was about to pull out. But the thing is that there was one image I managed to keep because I had like a strong argument. No? And it was a picture of the person who was shot at Exhume. He was shot in 1977 and Exhumed in 2003. And then the thing is that this image had been, the person I was in connection to was his daughter. So his daughter hadn't seen this image for 2 decades. Only an aunt of her gave it to her when she was already old and whatnot because it was like a family secret. And then I told the editorial, he was disappeared by Franco's statement because he was killed and shot and went to a mass grave. Then his image was disappeared by his own family because of shame or whatever. And the other, after going to allow it to disappear for the third time. And then, I thought that was kind of,
And they would be complicit in it.
Yeah, I said, no, this is completely, I mean, I will pull out the paper if you take that picture. And that was the only one I wanted to manage. But it also talks about the tensions, editorial tensions regarding this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because especially when you think about which image is appropriate and what isn't, and what the title does to the understanding of the image.
And it's different. I mean, when you're talking here about fiction, and then you have a real image of operation, and then you have a story behind it, as you would say, like the point of view of one. So I mean, you are put at the same level of the soldiers. So that's very.
You're in the river.
You're in the river.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah, but then the other way around, and that's a question that we already sometimes talk about, is that it's interesting that, for instance, the mass grave exhumations in Spain haven't had a lot of reflection in literary text. There are a lot of photo books, photo exhibitions, documentaries, but there are practically no novels that take up, that kind of respond to that memory work, while it is the spark that brought about this whole memory boom. So there's also something about the image being able to refer to another type of memory, or enhancing in another way of, or another needs than narrative can do, right? And I don't know, here in Spain I find that really...
But that's perhaps too early to tell, Marije. I think we may see that in 5 to 10 years. In this boom of memory books and novels and so on, I think is part of the same movement of digging out these people.
Of course, I also see it as part of the same movement, but for me it's interesting that the mass grave itself as a space, as a practice, doesn't have any reflection in narrative fiction, while it does have a lot of artistic production, but more visual.
Hundreds of thousands of images flying in the internet. I mean, it's like very body-centered, it's like very bone-centered, so to speak, the whole thing. But when it comes to literature, or even cinema, it's like really, and some of them are not very good, are very like local novels. I mean, Merino's novel is the one which directly related to restoration.
Yeah, but for instance, in Merino's novel, there are no bones. There is a mass grave that they want to exhume, and they don't. In the end, they don't exhume. So it's there, but it's at the same time still absent. And
but I think it's very fitting that then people are writing novels about what happened in the war, what happened to these people in certain town. I think that's a way of facing that particular problem. I think this is a close connection between the mass grave digging process and this boom we are having in recent years about the civil war, the fallen, the victims of crime repression. which leads me to a question I want to ask. But go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I said what I wanted to say.
Well, I am curious about the epistemological claim of fiction, which in Spain I think is pretty important. I think, and I wonder if in Iceland, I don't know, I know very little about Iceland, and I wonder if there is the same claim in Icelandic novel writing. In Spain, I think Almudena Grandes, Javier Cercas, I think explicitly or not, they make a claim about the truth that they want to convey in those narratives, as opposed to what they consider the other versions, even versions by historians themselves. And that even goes back to a long time in Spanish culture. I mean, we go back to perhaps, I don't know, I think there was, I read, I listened on the radio that there has been a new edition of the history of Spain, commissioned by King Alphonse X in the 13th century. So we have this king, who always became emperor of Germany in the 13th century, commissioning the history of Spain back in the 13th century. So, and there is always this obsession with the truth about the past in Spanish culture, through fiction, and also in Latin America, which I think that's I think the importance given to telling stories and narrating about the past. Now I don't know about Iceland about that. I wonder if you see a contrast there, or it just it's the same process.
It's not quite the same, but it has sort of similar questions that are being asked, and also another similarity is the history of it, because it has been around in Iceland for a very long time. Because our culture is based on the medieval sagas that were written in the 10th, and 11th, and 12th centuries. And that is the base of our culture, and base of our myths about our identity, and so on and so on. So, and it's the base of our language, and so on. And the most hotly debated thing about these sagas in the 20th century was it true or fiction? Were these novels, or were they telling the truth about Njál the Strong and the Vikings and so on and so on? So, and this debate has influenced and had consequences for novel writing in Iceland in the 20th century, definitely. Also, another thing that happens there, which is different here but raises the same questions, is because it's such a small society, people tend to think of the author and say, oh, this must be what happened to his family, and I know that this happened to him, and so on. Because it's such a tiny society, people make these kind of assumptions, and because they have all this background knowledge of people. So the truth claims for some of the novels that are now being published about the 20th century in Iceland raise similar questions. What is the relation between the fiction and the history and the past? Of course, I'm interested in the memory processes and the reenactment of remembrance and so on, but this is also something that has come up quite often.
Hay una nueva novela que tiene menos de una semana, que se ha presentado el viernes pasado en la Facultad de Periodismo. La novela tiene 3 o 4 meses, de una manera muy pequeña. Le ha hecho la presentación la profesora de Memoria Histórica, Mirta, y otra profesora de Literatura. Se trata del Escarmiento, de Miguel Sánchez Hostiz. Esta novela le ha llevado a él 5 años de trabajo y documentación, y es un escritor maldito. Así lo presentó la propia profesora de literatura, diciendo que los medios de comunicación no le están dando ninguna salida porque es del otro lado. Incluso en Navarra, de donde él es, los medios de comunicación le hacen el boicot porque no hablan de él, porque la historia está centrada en Navarra. Entonces es un trabajo excelente según las dos personas que lo presentaron, la profesora de literatura y memoria histórica, de 500 páginas y que es posible tenga una segunda parte.
Y es presentada como novela. Es presentada como una
está
novela.
hecha como una novela, pero la profesora de historia está encantada y la profesora de literatura está encantada también. Parece que es un trabajo excepcional. Y vais a ir a hablar muy poquito de esta obra y entonces, pues bueno, para que...
I think that there is actually a novel about the Spanish exhumations, which was written 2,500 years ago. And if you look at Antigona by Sophocles, which is basically playing out exactly that drama about unearthing, about burying, about dictatorship, orders, divine law, human law, state law. And he does it in a very interesting way because he sort of like gives voices to all these positions and makes the audience think that these positions are irreconcilable. And I think this is a wonderful example of what literature can do. And besides the fact that it is not responding to a certain event, it was written 2,500 years ago, it has a completely different context, it was written before it happened. And I think this is where one can take the strength of what literature can do. It's fiction, but it positions, it raises all these different voices in a way that, like, I think a social and cultural and political analysis cannot do in that way. It's like it's played out as drama. And it doesn't matter if it's like Spanish or Icelandic or Dutch or American. It's sort of like it's there. Sort of like it's there in a kind of like cultural universe and can be used. And Greek drama is I think great for us because if you look at the Oresteia, there you have like the Furies and you have ghosts, the ghosts of the past who are haunting and personally you have the conflict between revenge and justice and courts and Athena who then solves the problem of revenge by constituting a court in Athens and all that. So I think that if you look, and you don't have to be sort of like this is not the kind of like cultural studies approach where how does a certain national culture react to certain events. And I'm sort of collecting now all the books that have been written on the Spanish Civil War, and then I see what they do, and then I come to a conclusion. But this is sort of like transcending. It transcends time, it transcends space, it plays in a different context, it has been written in a different time. And this is, I think, what where there's like really an epistemological payoff to taking literature as something that can be brought to memory studies in a political, in a hard-nosed political way. Otherwise, we're just starting to collect, books and look at them and say, yeah, this is very interesting. They're books, they're TV series, they're newspaper articles, and we sort of like collect them and put them into little boxes and say, oh, look how people sort of like react to events of the past in a certain national context. But it doesn't really transcend into some kind of interesting form, I think. So I think that maybe if we look at Greek drama, then we have really a key how literature can be used in useful epistemological ways. And Antigona is like one of the best examples how this is being played out here in Spain, I think.
Do you have a similar case for the Holocaust, for example? Is there a Greek drama which also would... Just thinking about the huge amount of literature that came out of the Holocaust.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you have written in your what I've read about this wonderful book which has been translated into Hebrew. of course. And it's sort of like you read it in Hebrew, but I've shown it to my students, and it is about the Holocaust, but it is not about the Holocaust. Because it comes from sort of like, it is translated from Spanish, and it becomes like something else also through the translation, and it is about Primo Levi, and it's not about Primo Levi. And I think that, and especially when we use sort of like literature, we should sort of like transcend this national approach. And I don't think that a lot of is gained by doing national comparison. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, sort of like.
I do hope so, because I'm really going to blanket on my project.
No, I'm not quite okay. I mean, we all have to do a living. We all have to make a living, and we do what we have to do.
I'm hoping that it's a little bit more than that.
But I think that you're having these boxes, you know, Iceland, Spain, Germany, France, and then putting in these projects into these boxes and see, wow, there's this whole thing going on.
But I don't see that as conflicting at all.
No, it's not conflicting.
No, because when you're talking about memory processes, obviously you are working always about trying to look the cosmopolitan memory thing, like trying to look for common patterns or patterns which can be applied.
Which are not comparative, which is not national comparison.
It's not national comparison, but also we live in national context.
Yeah.
So. And it's important to see how I mean, you have to work both levels. I think if you stay there, you don't understand. For example, how, for example, this thing we have discussed. What are the explanations in contemporary, not just literature, but also in theater? I mean, there is one theater play or two or three, which just moved around, and they were quite successful. So, but it also allows you to understand why a particular political context in a certain specific place is played out, in the liberal arts or whatever. So I think, obviously, here the reference to Antigona is permanent. Everybody starts with Antigona, or at some point Antigona shows up. At some point, but it's not the whole story. And there are many other. I don't see the contradiction of working. As long as nation states continue to exist, once they disappear and vanish into the stratosphere.
It's exactly this interrelation, this connection between, I think, global tropes, and then still you can also wonder if Antigone is really a global plot or a Western plot. For instance, it says a lot to us, but what does it say to a Chinese?
Of course. Yeah.
Literature always Literature always has its national dimension, but it has lots of other dimensions as well. So I think it's important to explore, especially in connection with when you're talking about certain traumatic events and so on. And of course, I'm not, as I think I tried to say, I'm not looking at literature solely as a national product, but as a transnational one that is, in terms in Americans, is an object of remembrance, but also a product of remembrance. And this remembrance can be national at some level, but it's transnational in others, like this one. So, of course, Icelandic literature is locked into a box. It's called Icelandic. Very few people read this language. There are 300,000 of us who read it. So, I mean, it's not, although it is influenced by lots of global trends, and it is also something that needs to be brought out to other people for it to really interact with other cultures.
I'm not sure any more comments.
The Trojanas is by Ulysses. That's the Trojan, the female Trojans. That would be also very thought-provoking about the Holocaust.
But I also really agree with your point that literature is not only a reflection or maybe a representation of how people react to a certain event, but it can also work as a cultural product, like in a kind of performative sense, especially if there are ways to study to study the reception of literary works, you can see that they can actually produce a new plot or a new metaphor or a new way of understanding a certain past. So I would also, I
Does
would
that
not,
happen with the comprador?
no,
No.
no, but it has happened with Antigone. But yeah, so I mean, it's difficult to study, I think. But for instance, Sebald's Austerlitz, it could be an example of that. Or Primo Levi has set certain standards and certain metaphors that we use now, and we reuse and remediate to talk about the Holocaust. So.
Yeah, gray zone.
Gray,
yeah.
As a metaphor.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I think we can close the discussion now. I don't know if you want to say anything more.
Let's see.
Then let's eat. Yeah. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.